Hi, I'm Brian Russell, and I want to go over Psalm 96 with you. Psalm 96 is a praise hymn or a Yahweh Malak hymn. In other words, it's a specific praise psalm that praises Yahweh as king. Now, I want you to notice the structure. I'm going to go back over this again in a couple of minutes, but I made an initial error when I shot the rest of the video. That's two parts to the psalm, verses 1 to 6 and 7 to 13. So do make a note of that. And notice I will fix that later on in the video, but I wanted to make sure at the beginning that you see that the two sections are 1 to 6 and 7 to 13. Now, it fits in a context here, just to remind us of where we are in the Psalter. It's always important to see the context, right? Remember, Book 3 of the Psalms, Book 3 is Psalm 73 to 89, ended in a catastrophe. Psalm 88, you have the prayer of an individual who is dying and all alone. Psalm 89 is corporate. It's Israel lamenting over the apparent loss of the Davidic covenant and the fact that they're in exile. Well, how do you make a comeback? It's a back to basics. So Psalm 90, that's the beginning of Book 4, and Psalm 96 is part of Book 4. It runs from 90 to 106. Book 4 begins with a psalm attributed to Moses, which is significant, right? What do you do when the Davidic covenant ends, when it looks like the God's people are done? Well, you go back to the roots, which is Moses. And so the opening of the Book 4 returns to the anchors for Israel, right? And the ultimate anchor isn't reliance on a human king or human power. It's a reliance on Yahweh. So there's a block of Psalms here, especially Psalms 93 to 99, and Psalm 96 is right in the middle of this, in which Yahweh is declared the true king, the true source of security for God's people. And Psalm 96 is a beautiful hymn, and it really comes in two pieces, just to give a little structure, and then we're going to talk about some of the meaning that we can get out of this. But notice the structure. I think it breaks nicely into two pieces. And in both cases, what we have is we start off with essentially a call to worship, verses 1 to 3, and then again in verses 8 to 12. And then you get a substantiation, you get the rationale for the worship. So in a sense, you have a recurrence of substantiation that centers on worship in both of these things, because the two sections are structured in similar ways, though they have a different meaning. Now, it's also important to note here, among other things, that there's broadly a movement from particulars to the general here. This psalm has missional implications, because at the core, this psalm reminds us that the mission of God's people is to share with the nations the good news about the reign of Yahweh, right? And so the folks doing the worshiping here, this is the focus on God's people. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song, that God's doing something new. Sing the Lord, bless his name, tell of his salvation from day to day, declare his glory among the nations. This is telling Israel to declare God's glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. So we know that God's people are supposed to give the message. So the first part is on the worship of Yahweh by God's people for who God is, what God's done. That language of marvelous works, that's reminding God's people of those foundational acts of salvation, particularly the Exodus. It's always the background for what God's doing in the Old Testament. And we'll come back and say a couple of other things. But then in the second half, this now is directed at the nations themselves and even all creation. So you have this call to ascribe. It's another word for worship, essentially. Right? That you have this call to the peoples themselves to give God glory. Then that's going to spread to the heavens, to the earth, to the seas, to even the trees of the field. There's going to be this worship that's going on. And the rationale for that is going to be that Yahweh is going to judge the earth. So just notice you would call this a generalization, this overall movement. This is the particulars up here, and it moves to general in terms of the people who are doing the praise. This is God's people. Essentially, this is the nations and all creation. Now, I think there's also another structure that sits here. I think you can see this in terms of cause and effect. That, in other words, the praise of God's people declaring to the whole world the truth about Yahweh leads then to the ability of the peoples around the nations and even creation to be called to worship as well. By the way, this is sort of similar to what we see in, say, Psalms 148 and 150, where you have everything moving out to sort of an all creation praise, right? So those are some of the structures. Obviously, you probably found some recurrences, but notice a few things that we have here. When we're talking about Yahweh being king, this is just a reminder that God's kingdom, the very fact that Yahweh is king, is good news not just for God's people, but for the whole earth. And this psalm teaches us, I think, when we're thinking about what's one of the things that this is teaching, the psalm is driving us to recognize that we worship in light of that reality that God's kingdom will reign over all creation. So this is a psalm of audacious hope. Again, it begins with this threefold call. Whenever we see new song, that's inviting us to sing about the future glory that God's going to do, that it's already present. And so imagine the power of a psalm like this during times of chaos and uncertainty. Imagine how this psalm would have been heard in light of Psalms 88 and 89. So this is a psalm of audacious hope in the face of chaos and uncertainty, to say that we can find anchors in Yahweh. It also reminds us of the reality that despite what it appears that all people and actually all creation is one day going to give the Lord the honor due his name. Again, look at Psalms 148 to 150. Also take a look at Philippians in the New Testament, chapter 2, verses 9 to 11. Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Revelation 7, 9 to 10. And again, the mighty acts of salvation is in light of what God did in the Exodus. You can have hope about what God's going to do in the future. Now, as Christians, and now jumping ahead to like application and evaluation, clearly we focus on God's saving actions, not just in the Exodus, but as that extends into the New Testament through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Now, God's actions are communicated in some key truths. The first thing is that Psalm 96 declares that Yahweh is above all other gods. The Lord is great and greatly to be praised, as the song goes, and verse 4 says he's to be revered above all gods, for all the gods of the people are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. So notice this transcendent view. So God is separate. God's above the other gods. And so what this is declaring, I'm going to draw a little picture here, is there's Yahweh and then there's the gods. Now, does the Bible believe that other gods exist? I think the answer is yes, right? Parts of it. But here's the thing. Here's the apologetic that's important. And listen to this. This comes from Christopher Wright in his book, The Mission of God. I think he gets this right. And this is also influenced by the work of Richard Bauckham, who's a New Testament professor. The idea is in the Old Testament, much of it, the Old Testament doesn't assert that the other gods don't exist, because obviously they do, right? Idolatry remains a problem today because gods represented actual things, right? But here's the rub. The Bible doesn't deny the existence of other gods, but it denies this, that Yahweh is in such a class to himself that it's inappropriate to use the label God if you're, for the gods, because Yahweh is qualitatively different. He's incomparable. And so it's actually more of an apologetic about dethroning the other gods and enthroning only Yahweh. And that's what these Yahweh Malach Psalms are about. In matter of fact, and that the reason for that is the nation's gods, they're just idols, right? They represent real things, but the danger is always worshiping creation itself. What do I mean by the gods are real things? Well, there were gods of power, there were gods of sexuality, there were gods of fertility, gods of the harvest. Those are all real things, right? Those are things in our lives too. So the fundamental issue is, do we worship gods, or do we subordinate all of these realities that exist to the lordship of Yahweh? That's what this is talking about, because idols, they don't yield power. The Lord is the world's sole ruler. In creation, the Lord demonstrated his power over all deities. That's why verse 5b asserts that the Lord made the heavens. God also made the whole earth. And so only honor, majesty, strength, and beauty are for Yahweh. So that's the first half. So just notice that there's a lot of things that we can work on here if we're going to do some application about a call to essentially to idolatherapy, getting all of the idols out of our lives so that we can sing only to Yahweh the glory due to his name and bless his name and talk about his salvation. If we do that right, then it's a witness to the nations. And verse 8 begins, actually I got this all wrong. This is verse 7 here. Verse 7 begins the second half of the psalm, so I misspoke there a little bit. With a scribe. Now the focus is on the nations joining the praise. Now remember, the whole Old Testament, the goal was God called Abram and his family to be the agent of blessing to all the nations. So Psalm 96 anticipates that reality. Again, go back and look at Genesis 12:3b. Paul talks about this, how it carries on in Galatians 3:8. But Psalm 96 anticipates this and envisions the nations actually worshiping the Lord with God's people. Again, we have this declaration in verse 10 about the Lord is king. You can look at that in Psalm 93, 95, 97, and that this has to do with God's control over the earth. Now, verses 11 to 13 serve as the psalm's climax by exhorting even creation then to join in the praise. And the fields, the trees, the heavens, and the earth, which then leads to verse 13, which is what the reign of God means. There's going to be a day of reckoning. We could see that as the full consummation of God's kingdom, where God's kingdom of peace and love and justice and righteousness is going to reign forever. And that's good news, because that means the future is a good one, that God has control of the future, and it's going to be one of righteousness and faithfulness. And we can pray and sing this psalm in assurance that God's future is a beautiful one. As God's people, we get to be heralds and bearers of this good news to the nations, while presently praying with earnest Jesus' words, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If you have questions about this psalm, you can send them in to me, but you might ask yourself this: how does Psalm 96 envision our mission in the world? How does this psalm provide security for us in the present? And how is God's future day of judgment good news for us and for the world? How does this psalm teach you to pray? How does this psalm teach you to live? Thanks for listening. I'm Brian Russell, and it's my privilege to serve as your instructor on the Psalms.